Hello, how you doing, guys, tonight? Hope you guys are doing well. My name is Brant Hunt. My channel is simply called Discerning What is True. I am actually on Facebook, YouTube, and also Odyssey. And what I'm going to be reading tonight is Dr. John Coleman's work, which is also called Diplomacy by Deception. And we're going to be reading chapter 5. And we're going to, let me give you some preeminent deals here just to explain to a little bit about this particular chapter as I go into it. Many people think that Rockefeller is on the top, important person. Well, he's important, yes, but he's not on top, that is. There are others that are far above him. He's just a tool. They all have been tools that are being used for sinister type of things to happen to this world and to cause all kinds of trauma and destruction upon this planet. So I wanted to start here at chapter 5. The chapter is named Rockefeller, the Evil Genie. And we're going to start here. And so hope you enjoy. And thank you for being here. So no other industry has been corrupted as much as the mighty, powerful petroleum industry. And no other industry has it just earned the epithets hurled against it. When the American Indians led Father Joseph de la Roche d'Alilien, a French Franciscan missionary, to the mysterious pool of black waters in western Pennsylvania, they could not imagine what horrible results would come from it. The oil industry has survived all attempts to breach its walls, whether by government or by private citizens. The U.S. oil industry has survived personal vendettas by the late Senator Henry Jackson, which was Henry Scoop Jackson, and Frank Church, and has emerged from numerous investigations with aplomb and its secrets intact. Not even an antitrust suit could break its power. So we're going to continue here. The petroleum industry cannot be, let me just say one thing, folks, here. There's plenty of oil on this planet. There's more than enough for everybody. Everything that's being told to you right now is to tell you that there's not much left. That's a lie. It's about them profiting off of people who are struggling to make it in this life. And I'll tell you this much. No man has the right to rule another, period. No man has the right to rule over another. And that's the problem, is that we have people who believe that somehow the government should actually rule us, which is a lie. It's a fucking lie. And the reality simply is it puts people under enormous stress trying to live day by day, you see. But they don't care, you see. They're at the top, or they think they're on the top, you see. So I want to make that clear, because a lot of times people think, oh, we're such and such. No, what they're doing is simply is that if you read the Georgia Guidestones, they make it very clear of what their agenda is, you see. They're interested in getting rid of a lot of people. And it's not in a very pretty way. They want to reduce the population to 500 million people. That particular Georgia Guidestones has been there up since the 1980s, but last year it was destroyed, and it wasn't by accident why they did it, you see, because the younger generations, I'm 62 years old, is that the younger generations will not know this because they're not told about these things unless you tell them, unless you tell your children about this, because that's the key. The idea simply is they see us as inferior in a way that actually they want to destroy man, period. So they've used all kinds of tricks. Sometime we'll go into that. So the petroleum industry cannot be mentioned without naming John D. Rockefeller, who created Standard Oil of New Jersey. The Rockefeller name is also synonymous with greed and unwavering lust for power. The hatred the majority of Americans feel for the Rockefellers started when the big hands surfaced in the Pennsylvania oil regions. It began among the descendants of pioneer drillers who flocked to Titusville and Pighead, where the black gold rush was getting into its stride in 1865. John D. Rockefeller's ability to rob prospective prospectors and drillers of their own oil claims is strangely reminiscent of the pioneering efforts of Cecil John Rhodes, Barney Bernanke, and other Rothschild Warburg agents who provided the money for daylight robbery and chicanery practiced by their own con artists on the Kimberley Diamonds and the Rant Gold Claims owners. Nelson Rockefeller once claimed that the family fortune was an accident, but the facts speak otherwise. The paranoia and need for secrecy that surrounded John D. Rockefeller was handed down to his sons and adopted as a successful defense against outside prying into oil matters. Today, the Committee of 300 accounting firm of Price Waterhouse does the accounts in such a way that even the best accountants in various Senate committee have not been able to unlock the Rockefeller's finances. Such is the nature of the beast. The question is often asked, why was Rockefeller so profoundly crooked? One can only surmise that it was inherited in his nature. John D. did not believe in letting friendships stand in the way of his progress and warned his sons never to let good fellowship get a hold of you. His favorite dogmas concerned a wise old owl who said nothing and heard much. Early photographs of John D. showing a long, grim face, small eyes without a trace of any human qualities. In view of his appearance, it is all the more wondered that the Clark brothers allowed John D. in as their bookkeeper and then as a partner in their refinery. The brothers soon found out that the Rockefellers were not to be trusted. In a short space of time, they were forced out. Bought out, that is, according to John D., although Ida Tarbell's book, The History of Standard Oil Company, which is rich with examples of Rockefeller's cast iron ruthlessness and his inhumanity to all except himself. The Standard Oil Company was the most secretive run company in the history of the United States, a tradition carried on by Exxon and its affiliates today. It is said that Standard Oil was bolted down and barricaded like a fortress. Rockefeller's image became so tarnished that he hired Ivy Lee, a public relations man, to help him make his image into one of the philanthropists. But in spite of his best efforts, Lee was unable to remove the legacy of hatred left by John D. The tarnished image of Standard and the Rockefellers have carried over into the 1990s and will probably be there forever. Standard Oil was to be the standard bearer for the oil industry in the conduct towards nations with oil and gas reserves beneath their soil. The Rockefellers have always been a law unto themselves, and very early on, they decided that the only way to escape taxation was to place the bulk of their funds and assets outside of the United States. Already by 1885, Rockefeller had established markets in Europe and the Far East, which has accounted for a staggering 70% of Standard Oil's business. 70% of their business was actually in Europe and Far East, not here in the United States. You see, that's only basically a third, less than a third. But Rockefeller's march across the continents did not go unchallenged. Public resentment of Standard reached new levels after writers like Ida Tarbell and H.D. Lloyd exposed the fact that Standard was a company with an army of spies above local, state, and federal government who had declared war, negotiated peace, reduced courts, legislatures, and sovereign states to an unequal obedience to its will. Angry complaints poured into the Senate when the American people were told about Standard monopoly practice, which resulted in the Sherman Antitrust Act, but so deliberately vague was the law, which left several issues unaddressed, that compliance was easily avoided by Rockefeller and his brutes of lawyers. Rockefeller once described it as an exercise in public relations with no teeth to it. Never was John D. Rockefeller's influence in the Senate more keenly felt than during the Sherman antitrust debates. It was a time when individual senators were subject to great pressure by Rockefeller's lobbyists. Hold on just a second here. Sorry about that. Rockefeller suffered a temporary setback when May 11, 1911, Chief Justice Edward White handed down his decision in an antitrust case brought against Standard by Frank Kellogg. Standard was to shed all of his subsidiaries within 6 months. Rockefeller responded by employing an army of writers who explained that the special nature of the oil trade did not lend itself to its normal business methods. It had to be treated as a special entity to be handled just as John D. Rockefeller had done. To dilute John Wright's ruling, Rockefeller set up his own form of government. The new government took the form of foundations and philanthropist institutions modeled after the patriot system of the royal courts of Europe. These institutions and foundations would shield the Rockefeller fortune from income tax, which his paid hirings in Senate had warned him would be coming in the years ahead. This was the beginning of the petroleum industry government within government, power which is still in place today. No doubt the CFR owns its Council for Foreign Relations owes its rapid rise to power to Rockefeller and Harry Pratt in 1914, a member of the Senate called Rockefeller's Empire, the secret government of the United States. Rockefeller's strategy called for a private intelligence agency and followed their advice. Rockefeller literally brought the personal and equipment of Reinhard Heydrich's SS intelligence service, which today is known as Interpol, which is International Police, with intelligence likened to the best of Heydrich's SS intelligence behind them. The Rockefellers were able to infiltrate countries, virtually take over their governments, change their tax laws and foreign policies, and then pressure the U.S. government to fall in. If taxation laws became tougher, the Rockefellers would simply get the law changed. It is this basilicus in the oil industry that has closed our local production that would have made America totally independent of foreign oil. The net result, higher prices for the American consumer and obscene profits for the oil companies. The Rothschilds were soon on the scene in the Middle East, but their efforts to gain concessions were blocked by Harry F. Sinclair. It seemed that Sinclair was able to beat out the Rockefellers at every turn. Then came a dramatic reversal. The Teapot Dome scandal, which Sinclair's close friend, Secretary of Interior Albert Fall, and Fall's friend Mahoney were indicted for grabbing the Teapot Dome at Elk Hill's naval oil reserves for private gain. There were many who voiced concern that the Teapot scandal would set up the Rockefellers to discredit and remove Sinclair as the unwelcome competitor. The scandal shook Washington and cost Fall his job. That's why we had the word called Fall Guy. Sinclair was barely able to stay out of prison. All of his lucrative contracts with Persia, Russia were canceled. To this day, it is widely suspected but not proved that the Teapot Dome scandal was a Rockefeller sting operation, that is S-T-I-N-G operation. Eventually, most of Sinclair's concessions in the Middle East, with the exception of those held by Britain, passed into Rockefeller's hands. Events in Iran were soon to prove the power of Rockefeller and his British associates. In 1941, the Shah of Iran refused to join the so-called Allies against Germany and expelled its nationals from the country. Churchill flew into a rage and thereupon ordered an invasion of Iraq, in which he was joined by his Bolshevik Russian allies. By permitting Russian troops to enter Iran, Churchill has opened the door to the Russian presence in the region, one of Stalin's long for goals. This was a shocking betrayal of the Iranian people and the West in general, and showed that the Rockefeller influence was international. Such is the power of the petroleum companies, especially those controlled by the Rockefellers. The representative Standard Oil and Royal Dutch Shell oil companies advised Churchill to arrest and expel the Shah, which he promptly did, sending him first to Mauritius and then to South Africa, where he died in exile. Documents I examined in the British Museum of London show extensive interventions by the Rockefellers in the Middle Eastern policies. In the British Parliament, Churchill crowed, "We, the oil companies," he didn't say the oil companies, "we have just chased a dictator into exile and installed a constitutional government, placed to a whole catalog of serious-minded reforms." What he did not say was that the constitutional government was a puppet government selected by the oil companies, and his whole catalog of reforms were for the sole purpose of further entrenching the American and British oil interests to get even bigger cuts of oil revenue. But by 1951, the nationalist mood was sweeping the Middle East, which had begun in Egypt, where Colonel Nasser was bent on ousting the British from control of the country, spread to Iran as well. At this time, a genuine Iranian patriot named Dr. Mohammad Mossadegh emerged to challenge Churchill's puppet government. Mossadegh's main thrust was to break the power of the foreign oil companies. He judged the move of the Iranian people as right for such a move. This deeply alarmed the Rockefellers, who appealed to Britain for help. Mossadegh told Rockefeller and the British Petroleum that he would not abide by their concession agreements. David Rockefeller is said to have developed a personal hatred towards Mossadegh. Because of this, British Petroleum appealed to the British government to put an end to the nuisance that Mossadegh was creating. Churchill, eager to comply with the demands, as always, the Seven Sister Oil Cartel, made up the 7 major British and American oil companies in the Middle East, asked the U.S. for help. A talented, well-educated, and astute politician from a wealthy background, Mossadegh's desire to help the Iranian people benefit from their national resources was genuine. In May of 1951, Dr. Mossadegh nationalized Iranian oil. International advertising campaign was launched against Mossadegh, who was depleted as a silly little man running around Tehran in his pajamas. They always belittle people, folks. They just always do this. And you fall for their tricks. The public does. And you see them as, oh, they're such nitwits. In reality, they're trying to help their own people. Immersed in emotions, this was far from the norm. By the way, do you always, you remember the things of the great Satan, all that stuff, all that bullshit? We are the great Satan. This country is. You hear me? We are. Not some other countries over here, elsewhere in the Middle East. You always paint these people as some dumb radicals and whatever. In reality, simply, they're trying to help their own people. And you believe our stinking politicians out there who lie to you every day of your life. They're bought and paid for. Led by Rockefeller oil companies and backed by the U.S. State Department, international boycott of Iranian oil was ordered. Iranian oil soon became unsellable. The State Department declared its support for Churchill's puppet government in Tehran, which was installed when the Shah refused to join the Allies in the war against Germany. At the same time, the CIA and the MI6 launched a joint operation against Mossadegh. It's codenamed Operation Ajax. What follows was a classic example of how governments are subverted and toppled through diplomacy by deception. Churchill had lost the election after the war ended, was returned to power by a thoroughly brainwashed British public. He used his office to wage war against Dr. Mossadegh and the Iranian people through highwaymen and pirate tactics, as the following example shows. The Rose Marie, which sailed in international waters carrying Iranian oil, was not in breach of any international laws or treaties when it was ordered by Churchill to be intercepted by the Royal Air Force and was forced to sail for Aden, A-D-E-N, a port under British control. You see what's going on here, folks? Do you see who the pirates are? The hijacking of a ship at sea had the full backing of the U.S. State Department and the Rockefeller family suggestion. See, if the government people would stop doing this, this would stop. But people love money more than being actually principle minded. They don't have any principles. My source in London, whose job is to monitor the oil industry, told me in 1970 that Churchill was restrained by his cabinet only with a difficulty from ordering the RAF to bomb the Rose Marie. A year passed in which Iran suffered great financial losses. In 1953, Dr. Mossadegh wrote to President Dwight D. Eisenhower asking for help, never knowing what was going on. He might as well have written to Rockefeller. Eisenhower, playing a game, nerves, did not respond. The tactic had the desired effects of frightening Mossadegh. Finally, Eisenhower did reply in the classic style of diplomacy by deception. Advised the Iranian leader to abide by Iran's international obligation. Mossadegh continued to defy both the British and American governments. The oil company sent a deputation to see Eisenhower to ask that immediate measures be taken to remove Mossadegh. Kermit Roosevelt, who is actually a family member of Franklin D., who headed the CIA covert operation against Mossadegh, worked tirelessly to establish forces inside Tehran that could be used to cause unrest. They do this every time. They do it over and over because it works. They buy people. Large sums of money said by my source to have amounted to $3 million changed hands in April 1953. Shah Mohammad Pakhlavi, Reza Pahlavi, Pahlavi, under intense pressure from the international bankers, tried to dismiss Dr. Mossadegh, but the attempt failed. The CIA and MI6 equipped army of agents started to attack the military. Fearing assassination, the Shah fled, and Mossadegh was toppled in August of 1953. The cost of Americans to do this was almost $10 million. It's worth nothing that even while Kermit Roosevelt was preparing the CIA covert operations against Dr. Mossadegh in 1951, his Rockefeller partner were facing judicial proceedings in Washington that should have caused a halt to the operations in Iran. The fact is that all the all-powerful petroleum industry knew it could beat back the challenges it had done with all others. Justice Party proceedings were launched against Exxon, Texaco, Standard Gulf, Mobil, and SoCal. No effort was made to go after Shell and BP. Well, Shell is Netherlands, and BP is British Petroleum. Standard Oil immediately commissioned Dean Acheson to blunt the inquiry. Acheson proves a good example of how Rockefeller uses important people in government and private sector to override the government of Washington. Early in 1952, Dean Acheson went on to the attack, citing the interests of the State Department in protecting American foreign policy initiatives. These are not foreign policy initiatives, folks. This is just plain out business for American corporations who overrun other countries, thereby tactfully admitting that the major oil companies were running state foreign policy. Acheson demanded that the investment be shelved in the interest of not weakening our good relationships in the Near East. Acheson failed to mention the uproar and instability being created at the very moment in Iran by Rockefeller, the CIA, and MI6. The Attorney General responded with a sharply worded attack on the oil monopolists, warned that petroleum should be free from the grip of the few. Free enterprise can only be preserved by safeguarding it from excess of power, both government and private. He then accused the cartel of acting in a way that endangered national security. Rockefeller immediately ordered that damage control efforts put in place through his contacts inside the State and Justice Department. To this day, both are infested with the CFR, Council of Foreign Relations, Rockefeller agents. Acheson publicly denounced the investigation as an action by police dogs from the antitrust who want no truck with Mammon and the unrighteous. His tone of voice was at all times belligerent and threatening. Acheson lined up support for Rockefeller from the Defense and Interior Department, who vouched for the Seven Sisters in a most astounding manner. The companies, that is, the major oil companies, played a vital role in supplying the free world most essential commodity. American oil operations are, for all practical purposes, instruments of our foreign policy. King Acheson then attempted to raise the boogeyman of Soviet interference in the Middle East, which was nothing more than a red herring to distract attention away from how the oil companies operate. They always do this, guys. They do this over and over again. The boogeyman, Soviet Union, the Russians. Eventually, all criminal charges against the cartel would drop. I don't know if you know this, but Kermit Roosevelt was pushed by the Rockefellers when Japan went in and took the oil from China. The United States seriously was going to get itself. Actually, Rockefeller was pushing so hard with the Roosevelt's administration to get our forces, our military, to get involved in China. Do you know that? It's amazing. They didn't do it. The whole idea was to bait the Japanese eventually to get into war. To show their ultimate contempt for U.S. law, the representatives of the major oil companies met in London in 1924 to avoid possible conspiracy charges at the request of Sir William Fraser. The letter that Fraser wrote to the top executives of Standard, Oil, Texaco, BP, SoCal, and Shell said that they needed to meet in order to settle accounts for the now thoroughly aroused Shah. The conspirators met again in London 1 month later, where they were joined by the CEO of the French company, Francis de Petronas. An agreement was reached to form a consortium that would control the Iranian oil. The new body was called a consortium, as the use of the word cartel in America was deemed to be injudicious. Success was guaranteed. American executives told their foreign counterparts because the State Department had given its blessings to the London meeting. As far as the State Department was concerned, the Seven Sisters played a key role in the Middle East in fending off communism penetration in the area of vital concern to the United States, given the fact that in 1942, the very same oil companies backed Churchill in bringing Soviet Bolshevik troops to invade Iran. They're all working for the same group, folks, thereby giving Stalin his greatest opportunity to get a foothold in the Middle East. This was not exactly the truth. Throughout the Justice Department proceedings, which began in October of '51, State Department witnesses kept referring to the petroleum industry as the so-called cartel. The State Department is densely populated with Rockefeller agents, perhaps more so than any other of the other government institutions which David Rockefeller controls. It remains my firm conviction to this day that a way has not been found to break the Rockefeller chain that binds the oil companies in this nation to the Council of Foreign Relations. And if you understand anything, the Council of Foreign Relations is the sister of the Chatham House. The Royal Institute, you see, runs this whole thing. The American Council for Foreign Relations is just a sub deal. The United States, in reality, simply, if you understand anything, is that we are still subject to Britain, which controls every facet of our foreign policy towards the oil nations of the world. It is a situation that we, the peoples, will have to confront, hopefully sooner rather than later. Well, this looks like it's later. And we have plenty of oil in this country, folks. We have enough forever. Okay. In Washington, civil proceedings against the petroleum cartel fizzled out in the face of threats by the Council on Foreign Relations, which was backed by his puppet, President Eisenhower. Eisenhower said that the national security interests of the United States were being threatened. That's bullshit, okay, by the proceeding. CFR, they do this all the time. I'm going to give you an example of this, okay? Hello. Let's go back to the days of Obama running for office, and he got into office. Well, actually, before he got into office, he was actually saying that we're going – this is back in 2008, folks. This is now 14, 15 years ago. He specifically said that there will not be any more coal power plants built in this United States anymore. And there hasn't been. And actually, they've been closed down. You get it? And actually, it isn't him, Obama, has got the power. It's the people behind him telling him what to do. Okay? So that we have the most abundant mineral here in this country, which is coal, and it's been blackballed as being a poison, such and such, that now, guess what? We now, I know here in South Carolina, they've mainly closed all the coal power plants here, and they're now using natural gas. You see, and they were going to build a couple, 2 or 3, that is, nuclear power plants, and eventually South Carolina got in trouble. That is, the power company, South Carolina Electric and Gas, couldn't afford to do it anymore. You see, the costs are outrated. So it's sitting up there above Columbia right now, just wasting away, you see. But you and me, that is the people who live in the state, are still paying for that. No one gets in trouble. You notice that? You like this, it's a pop in the hands, and don't do that again. You see, the rich people will get away with murder, folks. But yet they'll throw a man in jail if he steals a sandwich at a grocery store. That isn't justice, folks. This has got to stop. You see? And when people start seeing this shit, and that's what it is, it will change. But people have got to open their eyes to see. You got to open your eyes. So anyway, let's continue. What I was trying to explain to you simply is that now natural gas is expensive. You see, and there's no competitors. There's no competitors. You see, they do this. While Kermit Roosevelt was going at it hammer and tongues in Tehran, Eisenhower Dulles, Allen Dulles, I assume, although the brothers were working together, offered the court a compromise that would, in Eisenhower's words, protect the interests of the free world in the Near East as a major source of petroleum supplies. No wonder Ayatollah Khomeini, decades later, would call the United States the Great Satan. Of course we are. We are. We are the Great Satan, folks. Get it in your head. You're not free, neither. You think you are, but you're not. See if you don't pay your payments on your house, that is your property tax, and see who takes it. Khomeini was not referring to the people of the United States, but to the government. Yes. Khomeini knew full well that the ordinary American was the victim of a conspiracy, that they were lied to, cheated, robbed, and forced to sacrifice the blood of the millions of their own sons in foreign wars, which they had absolutely no reason to take part in. And we're talking about World War I and World War II. Do you recall Germany attacking the United States? Hello? Did they do anything to us? Hello? And your teachers tell you so many lies that you're free. But if you're free, why do you pay taxes on your property? Tell me. So we continue on here. So Khomeini, if I have a student of history, knew all about the Federal Reserve Act, which he said kept the people in the grip of slavery. Yes, the bankers, indeed. When the U.S. Embassy in Tehran was seized by Revolutionary Guards, several compromising documents fell into Khomeini's hand, which clearly showed the CIA's involvement with the British Petroleum, Standard, and other major oil companies. Once the coup was declared a success, the Shah returned to his palace. Little did he know that 2 decades later he was suffering the same fate as Mossadegh. At the hands of the petroleum industry and its surrounding surrogate governments in Washington and London, the CIA and MI6. The Shah thought he could trust David Rockefeller, but like many others, it was not long before he realized that his trust was sadly misplaced. Having access to the documents that Mossadegh had dug up, which showed the extent of the plundering of Iran's natural resources, the Shah quickly became disenchanted with London and Washington. Upon hearing the news of revolts in Mexico and Venezuela against Rockefeller and Shell, and coupled with the news about Saudi Arabia golden gimmick, the Shah began to pressure Rockefeller and the British for a large share of the reigning oil revenues, which at that time amounted to only 30% of the total amount of oil revenue enjoyed by the oil companies. Other countries had felt the lash of the petroleum industries as well. Mexico is a classic case of petroleum companies' foreign policy making abilities, which transcended in national boundaries and cost American consumers a huge fortune. Oil, it seemed, was the foundation of a new economic order with undisputed power in the hands of a few people hardly known outside the petroleum industry. By far, yes. The majors have been referred to as a number of times. This is shorthand for the major oil companies that from the most successful cartel in the history of commerce. Exxon used to be called Esso, which actually is called Esso in Europe. Shell, which is Royal Danish, British Petroleum, BP. Gulf, which Gulf is no longer around, folks. Texaco, Mobil, and SoCal, that is Chevron. Chevron and I think Phillips 66 merged. Exxon and Mobil merged. Gulf is no more. And Texaco, Texaco merged with somebody else. I can't think of it. I think they bought out 50. No, was it Phillips 66? Maybe it was them. Anyway, together they form what I call a major network of interlocking, interfacing banks, insurance companies, and brokerage bonds, brokerage houses controlled by the Committee of 300, which are hardly known outside their circle. No one knows who these people are. These are the more powerful people than Rockefeller. Rockefeller is just kind of a stooge, he just gets his cut. He just gets a cut, you see, in order to exist. The reality of the one world government, a new world order, upper level government brooks no interference from anyone, no matter who it might be, even powerful national governments, the rulers of nations great and small, corporations and private people. These supranational giants have expertise and accounting methods that have Plumont's the best brains in government, out of whose reach they remain. Through diplomacy, by deception, it seems the measures were able to induce governments to Governments to parcel out oil concessions to them, no matter who opposed it. That is, John D. Rockefeller should very much have approved the closed shop, ran for the last 68 years by Exxon and Shell. It is evidence that the vastness and complexity of their operation, most often carried out like clockwork and other involvement activities in several countries at the same time, that the petroleum industry is one of the most powerful components that make up the economic operations of the Committee of 300. In secret, the Seven Sisters Club has plotted wars and decided among themselves which governments must bow to their depreciation. When trouble arises, such as the case of Dr. Mossad and later President Saddam Hussein of Iraq, it is only a matter of calling upon the right Air Force, Navy, Army, Intelligence Service to solve the problem and get rid of the nuisance. It can be no more trouble than swatting a fly. The Seven Sisters become a government within a government, and nowhere is this more the case than with Rockefeller's Standard Oil, SoCal, and Exxon and Chevron. If one would like to know American-British foreign policy for Saudi Arabia, Iran, and Iraq, one need only to study the policies of BP, Exxon, Gulf Oil, and Aramco. What is our policy in Angola? It is to protect Gulf oil properties in that country. Even though it means supporting a avowed Marxist, who would have imagined that? That is, Gulf, Exxon, Chevron, and Aramco have more say about American foreign affairs than members of Congress. Indeed, who would imagine that Standard Oil would one day control the foreign policy of the United States and have the State Department acting as if it were run for its own economic benefit? Is any other group so exalted, so favored with showers of tax concessions that run into billions of dollars per annum? I'm often asked, why is it that the American domestic petroleum industry, once so bustling and full of promise, went to a steep decline? The answer in one word is greed. For this reason, domestic production of oil has to be curtailed. You see, they got to pay taxes on that here. Get it? Get it? In case the public should ever discover what was going on, you see. There's plenty of oil in this country, folks. There's plenty of oil in Alaska. In fact, the oil fields in Alaska are as large as Saudi Arabia. This knowledge is much more difficult to attain when dealing with foreign operations. What does the American people know about what goes on in the oil politics of Saudi Arabia? Even while making record profits, the petroleum industry demands and gets additional tax breaks, both open and hidden from public view. Here, the citizens of the United States benefit from the huge profits made by Exxon, Texaco, Chevron, Mobil before it was sold. The answer is no, because most of the profits were made upstream, that is, outside of the United States, which is where the profits were kept. While the U.S. consumer paid ever-rising prices for gas at the pumps. Rockefeller's main area of concern became Saudi Arabia. The oil companies, by various stratagems, had entrenched themselves with the king, Saul. The king worried that Israel would one day threaten his country and strengthen the Israeli lobby in Washington, needing something that would give him an edge. The State Department, at the urging of Rockefeller, said it could only follow a pro-Saudi policy without upsetting Israel by using Exxon, that is Aramco, as a front. This information was given to the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. It was so sensitive that committee staffers were not even allowed to see it. Rockefeller had in fact paid only a small fee, $500,000, to secure a major oil concession from the Saul of Arabia. After considerable diplomacy, a deception was worked out, a deception which cost American taxpayers at least $50 million in its first year. That's 10% of that, folks, which came out of the discussions between Exxon and the Saul of Iraq, is known as the golden gimmick in the inner sanctions of Rockefeller boardrooms. The American oil companies agreed to pay a subsidy to the Saudi ruler not less than $50 million a year based on the amount of Saudi oil pumped. The State Department would then allow the American companies to declare such subsidies payments foreign income tax, which Rockefeller, for example, could deduct from the Exxon U.S. taxes. With production of cheap Saudi oil soaring, so did the subsidies payments soar. This is one of the greatest scams perpetrated upon the American people. The bottom line of the plan was that huge foreign aid payments were made annually to the Saudis under the guise of subsidies. When the Israeli government uncovered the scheme, it too demanded subsidies. Hello, we want some money, which today amounts to $13 billion per annum, all to expense the American taxpayer. Since the American consumer actually helps pay for cheaper import crude oil than domestic crude oil, shouldn't we benefit from this arrangement through cheaper gasoline prices at the pump? After all, Saudi oil was so cheap, and in view of the production subsidies, wouldn't this translate into lower gasoline prices at the pump? Does the American consumer derive the slightest benefit from footing this huge bill? No way. Apart from geopolitical considerations, the majors are also guilty of price fixing. The cheap Arab oil, for instance, was fixed at a higher domestic crude oil prices when imported into the United States by a subterfuge known as phantom freight rates. According to hard evidence presented by the multinational hearings in 1975, the major oil companies, led by Rockefeller companies, made 70% of their profits, as I said earlier, abroad, profits which could not be taxed at the time. With the bulk of their profits coming from upstream, the petroleum industry was not about to make a major investment in the domestic oil company. Of course not. They're not going to do that. Why would they? They got already sweet deals as it is. As a consequence, the domestic oil industry began to decline. Why spend money on the exportation and exploitation of the domestic oil when it was theirs for their asking in Saudi Arabia at a cheaper price than the local product and its far bigger profit? The sad fact, folks, I'm going to come off the record here, is what's happening now is going to change radically here in America. You understand? It's not going to get any better here, folks. Because now the dollar is no longer pegged to what they call a petrodollar. And that was a deal that actually took place last year, but it's actually just been put back in the media here recently. And the Saudis have already said that's what's going to happen. So the West is, all this has been done on purpose, folks. Is to destroy the West. It's to destroy Europe, be independent. The whole idea now is the West has done all these things in the past in Europe, and now we're going to, the ball is going to change to Russia and China. It's completely different. The game's changed. Kingdoms come, they rise, and they fall. And that's what's happening. Because we don't have anybody that knows how to do anything anymore in this country, hardly. Okay, I'm sorry, I got off. Okay. The unsuspecting American consumer was and is being shafted without knowing it. According to secret economic data, which a contact of mine who is still in the economic intelligence monitoring business showed me, gas in the pumps in America, given all local, state, federal taxes pile up on the price, should not have cost the consumer more than 35 cents per gallon by the end of 1991. Yet we know that prices at the pumps were 3 to 5 times greater without any justification for such excessive high prices. Well, all we have is a problem with some people who just are downright greedy, you see. They're not interested in sharing the wealth to you folks. They're not. Oh, they'll give you something, yes. They'll eventually use what I call the peasants of this country and buy them off, because most of them are too stupid and can't think for themselves. And they'll use them against the people here. They did that in Russia before. They'll do anything, they'll do the same thing. These are enormously cruel people. They don't have any feelings for you. They don't care. Get it? The immorality of this gross deception is that had the big oil companies, and again, I must emphasize the leadership of the Rockefellers in this, not being so greedy, they could have produced domestic oil, which would have made our gasoline price the cheapest in the world. In my opinion, the manner in which this diplomatic deception was set up between the State Department and Saudi Arabia makes the State Department a partner of this criminal enterprise, indeed. Or in order not to have a falling out with Israel at the same time keep the Saudis happy, the American consumer was loaded with a huge tax burden from which this country derived absolutely no benefits. And these guys come every 4 years or 2 years and beg you to vote for them. Will you understand one thing? Stop voting. You don't need to give your consent to these people. They're not worthy of honor. They're not worthy of any consent at all, period. They're not, folks. They are not looking out for your interests. Never will be. They look out for themselves. They're stinking lawyers. Isn't that tantamount to the involuntary servitude forbidden by the U.S. Constitution? The rulers of Saudi Arabia then demanded that fixed prices be posted by the oil companies, that is Aramco, meaning that the country would not suffer a decline in income if prices for oil dropped. When they heard of the arrangement, Iran and Iraq demanded and received the same fixed pricing agreements. The bottom line here is that the oil companies, led by the Rockefeller companies, paid taxes on an artificial higher price, not the real market price, which was offset by the lower taxes they paid in the United States, a major benefit not enjoyed by any other industry in America. This made it possible for Exxon and Mobil and all the Aramco companies to pay an average tax rate of 5%, notwithstanding the huge profits they were making. Not only were the oil companies gouging the American consumer, and still are, but they are also making and carrying out U.S. foreign policy to the extreme detriment of the American policy. This arrangement and actions placed the petroleum industry above the law, giving it a position from where the companies can and do dictate foreign policy to the elected governments, free of any control by our representatives in Washington. And what we're experiencing today, folks, is called inflation, you see. And the situation is going to get worse, far worse than people have any idea, you see. Even though there's plenty of oil here in this country, more than plenty. There is no scarcity. There's no quote unquote, what we call it, climate change bullshit. These people are just liars. They don't tell truth ever, folks. They never do. You know, once someone lies to you, you say, okay, maybe I made a mistake here. The second time they do it, shame on me. Well, folks, they've been doing this 100,000 times to people here. They just lie all the time because you're gullible. You are gullible to their practices. And that's not going to change because you're so gullible to what they're doing to you. Oh, that's okay. I'll give them some more of my money. But there isn't any more money, folks, anymore for people because very few people will have good paying jobs anymore. You see, a lot of those jobs are just starting to change too. You know, people are getting laid off at Apple, Microsoft, and others. Anyway, we'll go on. The policy of the petroleum companies cost the American taxpayer billions of dollars additional taxation and billions of dollars in excess profits at the pump. The petroleum industry, and in particular Exxon, has no fear of the U.S. government. Why should they? Thanks to the control exercised by the permanent upper-level parallel secret government of the Council on Foreign Relations, the CFR. Rockefeller is untouchable. That enabled Aramco to sell oil to the French Navy at 95 cents per barrel, while at the same time the U.S. Navy was charged $1.23 per barrel. One of the few in the Senate who dared tackle the awesome power of the Rockefellers was Senator Brewster. He discovered some of the slippery conduct of the petroleum industry during the hearings in '48, accusing the industry of bad faith with a various desire for enormous profits, which at the same time constantly seeking to cloak the United States protection and assistance to preserve their vast concessions. The Rockefellers drafted a memo signed by the bigger U.S. oil companies, the gist of which was that they did not owe any such special obligation to the United States. Rockefeller blatantly internationalism was finally flaunted for all to see if people knew about it. You know, it's interesting also how people cause so much damage to their own country. People who work for the media and tell lies. Oh yeah, I like to make some good money and I'll just tell lies to people. They don't have any backbone, folks. They're determined on their own country and their own people. Anything for a dollar. As an example of the foregoing, M.J. Eaton, in an article published by the oil industry, stated the oil industry is at present confronted with the question of government control when the U.S. government invited the American petroleum industry to name 3 members of the committee it had set up to consider conservation legislation. The API president E.W. Clark said, We cannot undertake to press upon, still less accede to, any suggestion that the federal government may directly regulate the production of crude oil in several states. The American Petroleum Institute argued that the federal government did not have authority to control oil companies under Article 1 of the U.S. Constitution on May 27, 1927. The API said the government could not tell the industry what to do, even where the common defense and the general welfare of the nation was concerned. One of the best and most far-reaching exposés of the petroleum industry is a 400-page report entitled The International Petroleum Cartel. Are people aware of something? Let me just tell you something. I've known this for a long time. Standard Oil came up with something back probably in the late 30s. They came up with a way of actually having coal, which this was to help Germany in the war. And this was given to IG Farben. That technology was given to them. Basically, they could crush coal and produce oil out of it. So that Germany had coal and could use that in the war. Are you aware of that? To keep the war going so that people, American troops, British troops, French troops, died on the fields for really nothing. Nothing at all. And then when they supposedly won, the Soviet Union took they took the territory that was part of Eastern Europe, took it all, took parts of Germany, East Germany. It's not now, it's not. But who knows? One of the best and most, I just thought that, sorry. Inspired by the late Senator John Sparkman, put together by Professor M. Blair, the history of the petroleum cartel is traced back to the conspiracy that took place at, I'm going to spell this to you, Achnacarry Castle, a remote fishing preserve in Scotland. Sparkman pulled no punches in a slashing attack on Rockefeller's oil empire. Professor Blair meticulously built up a case which proved that the major oil companies had entered into a conspiracy to achieve the following goals: to control all oil production in foreign countries insofar as production, sale, distribution of oil was concerned. 2, to strictly control all technology and patents related to oil production and refining. 3, to share pipelines and tankers between the Seven Sisters. 4, to share world markets among themselves only. You're not going to let anybody in, folks. 5, to act jointly to maintain artificial high prices for oil and gasoline. Professor Blair charged that particular Aramco had been guilty of keeping oil prices at a high level when it was getting salty oil at an incredibly low price. It's more profits. In response to Sparkman's charges, the Justice Department began its own investigation in 1951, which was dealt with earlier herein. Nothing has changed, folks. The Gulf War is a good example of business as usual. The occupation of Somalia has oil overtones, thanks to our new spy satellites. The Lacrosse imager, which can relay images of what lies underground. Very substantial oil and gas reserves were detected in Somalia about 3 years ago. The find was kept absolutely secret. This led to U.S. missions ostensibly to feed starving Somalian children. That is, this was showing on television night after night for 3 months. A starving children rescue mission was staged by the Bush administration as a means of providing protection for Aramco, Phillips, Conoco, Cohoco, COHOCO, I don't know what that is. It's another oil company, and British Petroleum drilling operations come under threat from Somali leaders who were becoming aware that they were about to be plundered. This is what this is all about. You're not saving anybody. This is not about freedom, folks. It has nothing to do with it. It's about stealing from every country in the world. The American operation had little to do with feeding starving children. Why did the U.S. mount a similar rescue mission in Ethiopia? Of course, it wasn't important. There's no oil there. Get it? Where starvation is a real problem. Obviously, the answer is that Ethiopia does not have any oil reserves. Of course. However, securing the port of Berbera is the chief goal of U.S. forces. There's a great discord in Russia over oil. Kurds will have to suffer again and again over Mosul, M-O-S-U-L, oil. Rockefeller and BP are still the greedy oil grabbers they always were. So that'll be my conclusion chapter here, folks. We'll do another chapter another time. We'll be talking in the next chapter will be Israel in Focus. And again, this is from Dr. John Coleman, who one time worked for Tavistock. He worked for them. So he knows their game. He knows a lot. I don't know if Dr. John Coleman is alive anymore, folks. I've looked up anything I could find on him, and there's nothing out there. I don't know if he's hidden himself or whatever. I don't know. But anyway, I appreciate you being here. I wish you a good night. You take care, and we'll talk again. Thank you.